Tomato plants, guaranteed to start an argument. Whoa, you've sown them way too soon. What, you haven't sown your seeds yet? Where are you? Where are your tomatoes? Are they still in the seed packet? Are they in the airing cupboard? Have they germinated and are growing on the windowsills of your house? Or maybe you're one of the lucky ones with a heated greenhouse or conservatory and your tomato plants are already planted. Everybody has opinions about tomato plants. Nobody asks a tomato plant, what do you want? It wants heat and light. How much heat? Well, it wants 20 to 25 degrees to germinate. That's about room temperature, an airing cupboard, or a propagator. And then ideally, it would love to be 22 degrees for the rest of its life. But that's quite expensive. How cold can it be? Well, 7 degrees or less, this tomato plant will stop growing. So as most things in life, it's a compromise. Really, if you can manage 12 to 14 degrees, your tomato plant will just keep on growing. And as the weather improves and we get more and more sunlight, it'll grow faster and faster. How do I know how warm my tomato plant is? Well, the leaves give you a bit of an indication. This one is cooler, so it's got darker green leaves. And this one is a bit warmer, so the leaves are lighter green. But perhaps the best way is to buy a thermometer. A digital thermometer will give you a 24-hour average. If your 24-hour average is between 12 and 14 or more, your tomato plants are reasonably happy. What about light? Your tomato plant wants as much as possible. Really, it wants sunlight, but if it can't have sunlight, perhaps a grow light. We know that tomato plants need heat and light. So if they get heat with not enough light, which would maybe be your house, they will be stretching and go tall and straggly. And if they're in an unheated greenhouse, where they've got light without heat, they'll end up small with very dark leaves and really thick stems. So the idea is to find a compromise between the two. Now we know what they want. Perhaps the next thing is to decide where to grow them. When to start sowing my tomato plants? Well, first of all, you've got to decide where you're going to grow them. We already know they need heat and light, so somehow you've got to provide that as they grow. If you've got a heated greenhouse or a conservatory, you could sow your seeds January, February. Your tomato plants might be planted and growing away right now. But most of us have got unheated greenhouses or tomato grow houses. Now you need to be a bit more careful. You need to do some research. Ask your neighbours. They might know when the best time is to plant tomato plants. If not, nip down the allotment. That's full of useful gardeners who know all about the local conditions. You could look on the internet, but you're going to get a huge amount of opinions. And the trouble is, nobody tells you where they live. So the location makes a huge difference. If you lived on the south coast, you could probably plant a month earlier than somebody who lives further north. So what you need is information. Do you look at the back of the seed packet? Not really, because most of it's telling you to sow January, February. What you really want is some more information on the weather in your area. For new gardeners, perhaps the best place to look is the Met Office average temperature maps. If you look at this one for May and find your location, you might find it's perfectly alright to plant tomato plants, or it might look like the temperature's too low and you'll have to wait a little bit longer. Ideally, we're looking for an average of 10 to 12 degrees. The other way is to monitor the temperature in your greenhouse or your grow house with a thermometer. Use a digital one because you'll get a 24-hour average, and if your greenhouse is doing 12 to 14 degrees, 24-hour average, you can put your tomato plants in there, they'll be quite happy. So what does it mean in practice? Well, we've looked at an unheated greenhouse on the nursery. So yesterday was a typical March day in Lancashire, dull. The outside temperature average was 9.5 degrees, and it dropped down to 5 degrees at night. In our unheated greenhouse, the average was 12.5 degrees, and it went up to 19 during the day, dropped back down to 7 at night. So you can see that an unheated greenhouse is normally warmer than the outdoor air. So what does it mean? Well, 9.5 degrees outside, too cold for tomatoes. 12.5 degrees inside, probably borderline. It would need to be a little bit warmer for your tomatoes to carry on growing. What if your tomato plants are taking over your house and you're desperate to get them in your greenhouse? Could you use an unheated greenhouse yet? There's two ways. One, could you heat it at night a little bit? That'll keep the frost away and actually raise the 24-hour average, so your tomato plants will keep on growing. You could bubble wrap the sides, that'll stop the heat disappearing, and you can use fleece at night to cover your tomato plants. What if you've got no heat? Well, then I think you've got to develop the hokey-cokey, so that your tomato plants go into the house at night, back into the cold greenhouse during the day. Will it work? Well, yes, because your house is really warm at night, and when it goes back into the greenhouse during the day, we already know it's 2 or 3 degrees warmer than outside, and with just a little bit of sunshine, it could be quite warm in there. The main thing is they're getting lots of light. So the answer is yes, you could use them, you just have to look at the weather and keep bringing them in and out. Right, now we know where we're going to grow our tomato plants. When should we sow them? Tomato plants should be about 6 or 8 weeks old when you plant them. So this means in practice that if you're going to plant them in May, you should sow them in March. And if you're going to plant them in April, you could sow them in February. In this picture you can see 3 tomato plants. The one on the left is about 3 or 4 weeks old. The one in the middle is about 5 or 6 weeks old. And the one on the right is about 8 weeks old. Probably the perfect planting size. It's still in a small pot. Why? Because that helps us control the growth. If you put a small tomato plant in a big bag, it quite often just grows really fast and forgets to develop the first truss. By holding it in a small pot, you can make sure the first truss is developed before you plant it. Here we are, end of March. How big should my tomato plants be? Well, if they're this size, these are for somebody who's going to plant into a heated greenhouse in April. These will be sown in February. What if your tomato plants are still tiny seedlings? That's all right. These will get pricked out, and these are for somebody who's going to plant in May. What if your tomato plants are still in a packet? You haven't sown them yet. Don't worry, we're still sowing tomato seeds. These ones that have just come through, these are still for planting in May. So how come they can both be planted in May? The thing is, the weather improves every single day now. We've got more light, more heat. You'd be surprised how quickly tomato plants catch up. So don't worry if you haven't sown your tomato seedlings yet. What if you've sown them too soon and they're growing too big for you? In the next part of the video, we'll give some tips and tricks on how to slow them down. Help, me tomatoes are running away. Perhaps you've sown them too soon, or perhaps you've just run out of room. There's a few tricks that we use in the nursery that can help slow your tomato plants down without actually doing them any harm. Perhaps the first one is heat. So here's a tray that's been sitting on a warm bench, and this is the warm side, and this is the cool side by the path. You can see there's quite a difference in height already. So this is a plant from the warm side, quite tall. You can see the amount of root on it. And this is a plant from the cool side of the bench, and it's got a lot less root, and it's about half the height. And if you look at the tops, this one's only taking half the room of this one. So if your tomato plants are running away on you, perhaps the first thing to look at is just reducing the temperature down a little bit. This is only a temporary measure until you get to the time when you want to plant, and then bring the temperature back up again. So you cool your tomato plants down. Your house is probably about 18, 19, 20 degrees. So you could actually cool them down to 10 to 12 degrees. And perhaps the easiest way is to put them in an unheated greenhouse during the day. So for instance, if the temperature outside today was 8 or 9 degrees, and your unheated greenhouse is running at 12 degrees, it'd be quite good just to put them in there during the day and then bring them back to the house at night. The other trick that we can use is to give them a lot less water. So these two tomato plants are actually the same age. This one's been sitting in a wet spot, so it's actually grown quite fast. And this one we've allowed to dry out to stop it growing. It looks quite drastic, but tomato plants can be dried out and it will stop them growing. So again, about half the height, and about half the height at the top as well, so you can use a lot less space. This is only, again, a temporary measure to slow them right down until you get time to plant them. Perhaps the other thing that you should consider is space. If your tomato plants are running away, it could be because they're too close. So on this side of the tray, these tomato plants are quite close together. And what happens is when tomato plants are shaded, they create a hormone that makes them grow even faster. So just by shading, they will grow faster and faster. If you space them so that there is more room around the plants, they will stop stretching and they will grow slower. And perhaps the final point is, if your tomato plants are running away on you, don't pot them, don't grow them into a bigger pot, because that gives them even more compost to keep growing. It's quite possible to keep a tomato plant in a plug for quite a long time. So if we didn't pot this, it would stay really, really small, and then as soon as we potted it, it would grow. So perhaps the worst thing to do with these tomato seedlings is to put them into the next pot. Just hold them and hold them until the weather changes or you're ready to plant them outside. So it's not disastrous if you've sown your tomato seedlings too soon. You just need to use some little tricks to hold them back. And then the thing is, next year, sow them at the right time. You won't need to use these little tricks and they can just grow away quite naturally.